Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. On this episode of The Greener Way, we're joined by Joshua Gilbert, a Worimi man who works and lives on country. Josh is a senior researcher at the UTS Jumbunna Institute of Indigenous Education and Research and is completing his PhD at Charles Sturt University, focusing on the post-colonial involvement of Indigenous peoples in Western agricultural systems. We're here to talk about Josh's research and why learning from Indigenous people's 65,000-year knowledge base is key to building thriving agriculture and natural capital markets in Australia. Josh, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Can you please fill us in a little bit more about yourself and your focus in your PhD research?
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks for having me. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'd like to start by acknowledging country. I'm joining from Worimi country today, and just want to acknowledge my elders past and present. And when we conduct acknowledgements and welcomes here on country, we say Gatiniran at the end, which means let us go together. And for me, that's really the spirit in which our mob work on this country and all the different messages that we share. Essentially, the PhD is and my research and my thinking is really about understanding what happened on different landscapes across what we know as Australia now, and fundamentally exploring the many ways in which truth-telling can help unlock the way in which landscapes work, operate, and what the future might be. So we know here on Worimi country, our people have farmed for about 65,000 years. It's a place where, where I live in Gloucester now, is a place where men's business is just in the mountains over this way and women's business is in the mountains over the other way. And it's a place where, my family have the first recorded birth in the caves in the mountains, just to the left of me. So this is very much home. And our story in terms of Western agriculture started in the 1820s when the Australian Agricultural Company got gifted 1 million Worimi acres and got told to set up camp and start farming. So we have this long-standing history in terms of Western agriculture as well, almost 200 years of, really the first landscape that Australian agriculture in the way it looks now, particularly in terms of export markets, was set up. It all started here. Mm-hmm. This is ground zero kind of thing. So for me, really, this place is important in the truth-telling that happens here. And my research really aims to connect all of those stories, all of the learnings and all of the lessons to say, we as Indigenous people aren't static people. We didn't stop our cultural connection to landscape in the 1820s when our land was gifted, and that our involvement in agriculture is very much the same in many ways to what Western agriculturalists have faced over time. There's a few complications in that, native title and fair wages and the whole heap of other stories. But fundamentally, our role is just as important when we think about Western agriculture in Australia then as what it's going to be into the future.
Fantastic. I'm trying not to get too bogged down in wanting to ask questions about what it would be a 65,000-year-old midwifery story as well.
Yes.
When you're talking about the paintings in one part of Worimi country. So I'm going to refocus this. Can you tell me a little bit, I'm really intrigued by this, about the history of agriculture in Worimi country, Josh. Are Worimi people graziers? Is it tilled land, cropping land? Can you paint a picture for our listeners about your country?
Yeah, so I mean, predominantly now it's beef cattle country, but it didn't start as beef cattle country back. Obviously, a long-standing Indigenous history, but even in terms of Western agriculture, AACO thought that this was perfect sheep country, mm-hmm. And actually we have there's a whole heap of testaments to that remembrance. So the mountain ranges around here in the very first kind of Western journals that were written and recorded of this country talk about this place as almost being castle-like in this remembrance of what England looked like. And, there's commentary that said, that the surrounding hills and mountains almost look like decrepit castles in the landscape. And, obviously we have this very English word of Gloucester being the place in which we call home. Mm-hmm. And just down a bit further from us is Stratford. So, very English names. But this is a test bed of what agriculture is going to look like in Australia as well. So it's, we know it's very high humidity, high rainfall area. There's quite a lot of issues when they started bringing sheep here. So they started testing and looking at different agricultural methods here. So we had crops being grown. We had a whole range of cotton and wheat and canola, all these kind of things that were all happening on this landscape. None of them worked until beef cattle started coming here. So it very much was a test bed. Then pivoted, I guess, into dairy farming, and then has now moved on to beef cattle farming, given that dairy isn't as profitable as what it once was.
That's a 200-some year history, but how about the rest of the 65,000 years in terms of either, the stories in history that were handed down or the evidence on the ground? Is this land traditionally been grazier land for the majority of its 65,000 years, and as it's been, occupied and owned or stewarded by the Worimi people?
Yeah, so our connection with this land is very different, and I think the way in which we use landscape is very different to how we think about it now.
Mm.
So we actually relied upon a lot of seasonal or environmental indicators to tell us when this country was ready for a break, and when to move back over to the coast. So it's quite well recorded in terms of Western literature, but we, Worimi people, in this kind of mountain range country, and not too far from here is ancient Gondwana rainforest, the Barrington Tops. And when the hairy worm would move on the ground here, that was an indication for us that it was time to pack up, maybe burn a bit of country and keep that for the next season and move back over to the coast, where we've got the beautiful beaches of Foster and Tuncurry. So we're very much this kind of transitional people. I think we, as a mob, identify as saltwater people, but we spend a lot of time in this kind of freshwater locations as well, and really use nature to move across the landscape, and to really tell us when that time was there. And I guess probably equally as important, a lot of our totems are saltwater animals. So obviously spending a lot more time on the coast and having that strong connection to there. The way in which our mob survived off seafood is really fascinating. It's so much more unlike kind of Western society now, and really listening or reading and understanding the stories from those times that have gone past really show the impact that agriculture and climate change and all these other environmental burdens upon this landscape has really taken. So there's stories of our mob going down and swimming and picking up crayfish, as big as fists, one in each hand, and that being common practice. That's certainly not the case now, I guess, when we go swimming.
Mhm.
So those kinds of stories are really important to understand what this landscape must have been like.
Which is the perfect entry to my next question. There's this beautiful, 10,000 year scope of caring for country and knowledge that's present in what you're talking about, Josh. What do you think the modern agriculture sector can learn from Indigenous peoples and their knowledge of land? Can we see the hairy worm coming out of the rainforest now and know that it's time to give a section of country rest?
Well, potentially. I think the way in which our landscape works is very different
Yeah.
to that now, and it'd be fantastic to have enough land to really test and model that to see if it still has attribution and meaning today with a Western agricultural system.
Mm.
I'd love the chance to do that, but I don't think I'll ever get the chance to see that be actualized.
Yep.
But I think fundamentally what our mob stories and lessons are, particularly over the last 200 years. We started farming Western commodities at the same time as what most Australians did on this landscape. My dad's family, whose history is very well documented because members married bushrangers, and there's a well-known story around here. That history of actually having that connection, coming together and starting to farm sheep on terrible country for sheep, but starting to come together and share the understandings of this landscape and what it means to be here,
Mm.
and then looking at how you implement that into common agricultural practice is very much a learning our mob have, not only just here in Worimi country, but right across Australia.
Mm.
So I think we've been incorporating some of that, and what we're asking for now, and what we, I think, have the opportunity to do is really weave in that bigger story, that much larger story of, well, what are those longer standing lessons? And then how do we think about this landscape for the future so that we can keep farming for the next 65 plus thousand years?
I love that. I originally heard you speak at the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute conference, Josh, in October, and I love the fact that we've had 65,000 years so far, and you're looking forward to the next 65,000 years. That's a great time scale. That's a long-term investment right there.
Well, it is, but it's also important, I think. Too often when we think about sustainability, we talk about a 5 or 10-year sustainability framework, and while that's great and kind of does provide action and some activities that people can commit to. When we start thinking about what this landscape's going to look like in 65,000 years, given the impacts of climate change, there's a lot of very different questions that we start asking, and a lot of different thinking that we need to start implementing to make sure that this country is at the best it can be.
So there's a huge focus on this, obviously, when we're talking about things like decarbonization, climate change, natural capital. How can we make sure that investors and government and business are improving their focus on these environmental outcomes that you're talking about, and making sure that Indigenous communities and traditional owners have their rightful place in this process?
So there's many ways, and probably the quick wins are really implementing some of the strategies that organisations already have. And I think for me that there's thousands of organisations now that have a reconciliation action plan or a commitment to First Nations procurement and employment. And what I hope is that large scale investors can think about how they can better utilise their investments to then chase the supply channel down and really invest and back good Indigenous businesses that are out there doing fantastic things. So a really practical example of this is, there's some guys I know who are, Aboriginal cattle farmers. They're some of the best cattle farmers in their breeds. They get the top price for some of their animals. They're doing a fantastic job. Where, a big investment organisation or superannuation fund invest in agriculture to try and get a return, they should be putting pressure on their agricultural managers to say, you should be procuring from an Indigenous business. Go out there and find the black farmers who are doing a cracking job on their livestock, who are going to get the same kind of livestock that you're going to buy from anyone else at the market, and go out and back them, give them a buck, and really kind of actualize that process so that we can get mob farming it onto the landscapes. Another real practical example is, if you have all this landscape, well, then how do you get, Indigenous fire practitioners from the Fire Sticks Alliance, for instance, to come out and do cultural burning on your land where it's appropriate, and have that connection, and then get them back every 12 months or whenever the season tells you, so that they can come out and keep doing it and have that long-standing connection on their landscapes. All of these things are out there that, all these Indigenous businesses are certainly starting up. We're just really slow at really providing opportunities for them in terms of Indigenous business.
Listen, in terms of traditional fire burning techniques, that's one of the things that has become integrated into methodologies for Australian carbon credit units, for example.
Yes.
With this whole new world of natural capital, are there other, pockets of Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous practice that you think would translate over to that natural capital approach?
Oh, so much. I think, and this is one of the issues, is that we need to make sure that we're taking a very localized approach. I think, it's very easy to say, oh, we'll just pick up a methodology or a learning from some Indigenous group somewhere and hope that it sticks on different country. Yeah. So really, I think it's important to have really local connections, so that people are connecting locally and understand the stories very specific to their landscape. Because not all of this country was meant to be burnt, for instance. But I think we have this real perspective in Australia that, oh, well, if it works and it's okay in one area, then we'll just keep replicating it and hope for the best. So where we can learn and approach local Indigenous groups and understand how they manage country and what their stories are on country as well, all of that kind of provides a very new perspective for different businesses on how they can manage landscapes better. And then also, what are the natural benefits that come with that? And then how do you put a value on kind of that connection? And I think very important to differentiate how you put a value on culture and kind of, getting mob, and then, very different to how do you get mob involved and then put a value on that.
I keep throwing back to this. We did an interview with Jack Lattimore, who's the Aboriginal reporter for The Age down here in Melbourne.
Yes.
And this concept of slow journalism and taking the time to invest in relationships through the lens of journalism, which is something I'm activated by. But I would assume the same applies in this situation, that you have to be invited onto country. You have to be, to gain this knowledge and this local perspective as applies to very, deep and specific local lore. And that's a fascinating opportunity.
It is. And I think the other important bit is that mob are involved in the systems. So what we don't see in agriculture, for instance, is a lot of mob in leadership roles who are out there saying, this is what an Indigenous agricultural system looks like, and this is how you can support us in doing it. So what we instead see is a whole heap of non-Indigenous people out there saying, this is what we think Indigenous systems look like, and here's our methodology that we've developed on the back of that. Let's hope that sticks, and feel free to say that you're farming in our method. So that's the kind of shift that needs to happen. And equally, I think in the environmental space, one of the things I get very frustrated about is the impact of just saying, oh, we've approached mob, or we've had lessons or learnings from mob, but we don't see mob in those very broad leadership roles, or it's very rare to see mob on different boards and things like that. And they're the shifts that we need. We actually need mob leading there, so that we have an equal seat at the table, not because we're blackfellas, but because we're really good at what we do, and to actually sit down and say, well, this is what I'm bringing to the table, and slowly build those relationships so that our knowledge can be interwoven into some of these approaches.
That's a missing piece of a lot of conversations, Josh, but it's particularly apt here when we're talking about agriculture and natural capital. So with that as mind, as the lens, what's the key work going forward for you in terms of your research, your work for Caring on Country?
Yeah, so for me, this probably takes a few angles. One is actually narrating what Indigenous agriculture looks like today. And that's, fundamentally the role of the PhD is to really tell the story that mob were involved in the sector, and that we need mob continue to be involved in the sector. Some of the statistics are really kind of terrible. We have 2.1% of the workforce that actually identify as Indigenous, despite owning nearly 60% of Australia's land mass. Less than half of the agricultural revenue that comes out of farm gate values actually goes back to Indigenous people, despite owning 60% of the landscape. We have less than 5, like the number 5, and I'm always very careful about saying like the number 5, because I think people say 5%, that's great, but just the number 5 of university graduates from every university in Australia that are studying agriculture. These are the kind of big shifts that need to take place, as well as organisations really committing to not just reconciliation action plans and targets, but actually embedding cultural awareness training and really seeing what some of their work can do on the ground to create those relationships, and to do more than just the numbers, I guess. While the numbers are important and we need to be growing the Indigenous business sector, we need to go beyond that and really think about what are some of the other opportunities. One of the elements is telling the story, showing that we're not scary, that we have our same agricultural yarns as well. And I always say, I listen to country music. I grew up driving country roads and, sitting in the back of utes and having that connection just like any other country kid. And that's just as important, saying that we're, very much the same, but have very different worldviews in what we do. That's a really, important part. Another part is kind of growing out the academic literature and actually planting the flag in the ground and saying that we all want to own this space, and we're not just going to let non-Indigenous people come in and tell us what we should be doing or what our methods are. And I guess the last bit is around trying to think about what that future state is going to be for mob. Even just I know I have this 65,000 year lens, and that's super important, but our agricultural system in this conversation is about 40 years behind that of the US and Canada. And what I want to make sure we do is rapidly kind of advance on that and get beyond them. So we need to be creating, an Indigenous Agricultural Research and Development Corporation, so we can fund the research that we want, rather than agricultural organisations telling us what we can and can't do. We need a Black advocacy body that's kind of pushing government and organisations to not only be doing RAPs, but to actually have our policy listened to at a federal and state level, not just white farmers who think that they know us best and want to ensure that they can continue farming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think lastly, we just need to show that mob belong in the space, and whether that's through media or through social media or other promotion work, we just need to show a black face, riding a horse or driving a tractor, and show that mob belong in this space and that that's a viable career path going forward.
Call to arms to our listeners here at The Greener Way who are talking about ways in which they can channel investment dollars to championing excellence in Indigenous and Black culture. So putting it all out on our listeners. So Josh, you've painted a beautiful picture for us through this conversation about your country, Worimi country. Where do you see yourself, Josh, in your future? And what does that look like?
I probably don't think about myself in terms of that lens. I think, for me, it's fundamentally about enabling more youth. I don't need to be the person. It's really just saying, what are the opportunities for the next generations who want to do this, and how can we back them to really get, take the bull by the horns, I guess, and really kind of approach this in a direct way. So I feel like a lot of the work I do is trying to knock down barriers and to create a network so that, the next generation of black fellas that come up behind me can say, oh, we want to speak to this fund manager. We've got this cracking business idea. How do we facilitate that? I can say, well, here's our mate's number. Just give him a call and say that I sent you, and, really break down those kind of institutional barriers that exist. Even just like lawyers and things like that. Like, there's not many mob out there who have a direct connection to a lawyer who can get, just that little bit of advice when you need it. So really breaking down some of those things. And, fundamentally my role is to enable the next generation, that next 65,000 years of people who come next. So the little bit of the story that I help try and shift now is all in testament to that hopefully one day I'll be able to get a bit of land that will cement that ability for the future as well, and really, show that practical nature of what I'm trying to embody, and really just have that, on behalf of our mob to say, well, let's do this and show it can be done right.
Josh Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.